We think we know the story. A wooden horse, a city betrayed, a night of fire. But what if the truth was different? What if the Trojan horse was never a gift, never a trick, but something far more real and far more human? For 3,000 years we have told the same tale. Yet beneath the words lies a secret history of power, ambition, and survival. Tonight, we return to the shores of the ancient world, to the city that vanished in flame, and to the lie that made it fall. This is not the myth of the Trojan horse. This is the truth behind it. Long before the fires of Troy, the world was smaller, quieter, but no less dangerous. Across the Aegean Sea, between the islands of Greece and the coast of Anatolia, kingdoms rose and fell like the tides. The Bronze Age, a time when empires were made not by nations, but by names. Mycenae, Pylos, Knossos, and Troy, cities of gold and stone, bound together by trade, ambition, and fear. It was an age ruled by honor. To the Greeks, a man's name was his soul. Glory was not found in peace, but in struggle. Death on the battlefield was not tragedy, it was proof of worth. And above all of it, watching with cold curiosity, were the gods. To live in that world was to live under their gaze. Every storm, every sickness, every victory or defeat was seen as the will of divine hands. The Greeks did not believe in chance only in favor or punishment, and within that fragile balance of belief, human pride grew stronger than any army. The city of Troy stood at the edge of this world, at the mouth of the Dardanelles, where the Aegean Sea narrows into a strait. Troy commanded the trade routes that connected east and west. Ships from Egypt, Cyprus, and the Levant passed beneath its walls. Gold, tin, and ivory flowed through its markets. It was a city of merchants and warriors, ruled by King Priam wise, old, and cautious. For generations, Troy had known prosperity, but with wealth comes envy, and beyond the horizon, the kings of Greece watched and waited. In that age, the world had no single truth. History was not written in books, but in song. Every war, every loss, every hero was carried by poets, storytellers who turned memory into myth. Their voices were the record of a civilization, and among those voices, one name would outlast them all: Homer. We do not know if Homer was one man or many. We do not even know if he ever lived. But his words survived, carved not in stone, but in memory. Through him, we inherited the story of Troy, a story that may have begun in truth and ended in legend. The world he described was both familiar and strange. Chariots thundered across dusty plains. Warriors wore armor of bronze and crested helmets of horsehair. Their swords were short, their shields wide, their tempers quick. Their gods were jealous and cruel, demanding sacrifice and praise. And among the mortals, the hunger for glory drove men to destroy what they loved most. In this world, kings were not distant rulers, they were warriors themselves. They led from the front, fought beside their soldiers, and died in the mud. And yet, behind the clash of weapons, their fates were shaped by prophecy and pride. It was said that the fall of Troy had been foretold long before the first ship set sail. When Queen Hecuba of Troy carried her son in her womb, a dream came to her. She saw herself giving birth to a burning torch. The prophets said it meant her child would bring destruction to the city. That child was Paris. To save Troy, Priam and Hecuba ordered the infant left to die in the wilderness. But fate, or the gods, had other plans. A shepherd found the boy and raised him in secret, never knowing the blood he carried. Years later, Paris returned to Troy, unaware that he was the spark that would one day light its ruin. In Greece, the world was just as restless. The great kings competed for power, bound together by fragile oaths and endless rivalries. Among them, one ruled above the rest: Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, brother to Menelaus of Sparta. Together, they commanded the richest armies in the Aegean. But it would take more than ambition to unite the Greeks. It would take an insult, a loss, a reason to fight. Far from these struggles, in the halls of Olympus, another story was beginning. The gods, it was said, were gathered for a wedding, the union of Peleus and Thetis, parents of the future hero Achilles. All were invited except one, Eris, goddess of discord. Angered by the slight, she appeared unbidden, carrying with her a single golden apple. On it were carved 3 words, "To the fairest." The gift was beautiful, but it was poisoned. 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom; and Aphrodite, goddess of love. Unable to decide, they turned to a mortal judge, a shepherd prince of Troy, known for his beauty and his calm heart. His name was Paris. Each goddess offered him a promise. Hera offered him power to rule over all men. Athena offered him victory, eternal glory in war. Aphrodite offered him love, the love of the most beautiful woman alive. Paris chose love, and with that choice, he sealed Troy's fate. The woman Aphrodite promised him was Helen, queen of Sparta, wife of King Menelaus. Her beauty was said to be a gift from the gods. Her voice could quiet a room. Her presence could turn peace into envy. When Paris journeyed to Sparta as an envoy, Helen met him at the palace gates. No one knows what passed between them, only that when he left, she went with him. Some say she fled willingly. Others say she was taken. But in the end, it made no difference. The oath was broken. The kings of Greece were bound to avenge the insult. From every corner of the Aegean, warlords gathered their fleets. 1,000 ships assembled under black sails, carrying the pride and anger of a generation. Odysseus of Ithaca, Ajax of Salamis, Achilles of Phthia, and at their head Agamemnon, the high king of Mycenae. The wind carried them east toward Troy, toward destiny, toward a war that would outlive them all. And somewhere in the shadows of that fleet, perhaps, the gods watched, silent and amused, for they knew what men did not, that the fire had already been lit, and when it reached Troy, it would burn everything truth, honor, and the memory of what was real. When the winds rose and the sails filled, the fleet moved like a single creature. 1,000 ships crossed the Aegean, the sound of oars and voices carrying over the waves. From the shores of Greece, they set their course toward the rising sun, to the city that had stolen a queen and defied their pride. The sea itself seemed to hold its breath. Men believed the gods were watching, and perhaps they were. The voyage was long. The ships creaked and shuddered in the wind. Soldiers whispered of omens and dreams, of shadows beneath the waves. The war had not yet begun, but already it lived in their minds. Every man on those decks carried a promise, a fear, and a hope that his name would be remembered. For them, Troy was not only a city, it was a test of fate. When they landed on the shores of Anatolia, they found not a battlefield, but a world of stone and wind. The plain of Troy stretched before them, flat and open, its fields already scorched by the summer sun. At its edge stood the walls high, smooth, and silent. They seemed less like walls and more like mountains carved by gods. From their battlements, the Trojans watched. There was no panic, no rush to fight, only calm defiance, as if they had seen this coming all along. The Greeks built their camp on the sand and raised their banners. For days, both armies waited, each testing the other with small raids, with skirmishes that cost lives but changed nothing. The war did not explode. It began to sink in, slowly, like a weight. The songs would later tell of duels and heroes, but the truth was harsher. Most men died unseen, lost in the dust and heat. The siege became a rhythm, fighting by day, mourning by night. Within the city, life continued in uneasy silence. Markets opened, children were born. Priam ruled from his palace, flanked by his sons Hector and Paris. Troy was not only a fortress, it was a home. The people trusted their walls and the favor of the gods. But each morning, when the smoke from the Greek camp rose in the distance, they knew what waited beyond. Among the Greeks, the greatest of warriors was Achilles, young, proud, touched by prophecy. His mother had once dipped him in the river Styx, making his body invincible except for one small place, the heel by which she held him. He was the Greeks' fiercest weapon, their hope and their curse. Beside him fought Patroclus, his companion, his mirror in loyalty. Together they became the fire at the heart of the army. Hector, son of Priam, stood as Troy's answer. Where Achilles fought for glory, Hector fought for duty. He was the defender of his people, a soldier who would rather die than see his city fall. Between these two men, the war found its meaning. They did not hate each other. They simply lived in a world that allowed no peace. As years passed, the war lost its shape. It was no longer about Helen. It was about endurance, about pride, about the stubbornness of kings who had forgotten why they fought. The gods themselves took sides. Athena guided the Greeks. Apollo favored Troy. Zeus, distant and patient, watched them destroy each other, knowing that neither side would win in any true sense. The 10th year arrived with weariness. The beaches were littered with the remnants of ships and bones. Food grew scarce. Disease spread through the camp. Even the songs of the poets grew quieter. Achilles withdrew from battle, angered by Agamemnon's arrogance. Without him, the Greeks faltered. The Trojans pushed them back to the sea. And yet, even in defeat, destiny moved forward. When Patroclus took Achilles' armor and went into battle in his place, he fell beneath Hector's spear. The loss broke Achilles' rage open again. He returned to the field, unstoppable, a storm made flesh. He killed Hector before the gates of Troy, and for a moment it seemed as though the war might end. But wars born from pride have no clean endings. Achilles himself would not live to see Troy burn. An arrow, guided by Apollo, struck his heel. The invincible fell, and with him the Greeks lost their brightest light. What remained was exhaustion, bitterness, and the slow erosion of hope. The war had devoured its heroes. Now it turned to the minds of men. Among those who still believed victory was possible was Odysseus, king of Ithaca. He watched the battles, counted the dead, and understood what others did, not that Troy would not fall to strength. Its walls were too high, its people too resolute. But walls, he thought, are only as strong as the hearts behind them, and hearts could be deceived. In the tent of Agamemnon, the leaders met in silence. They had lost too much to give up, yet gained nothing by fighting. It was there, among the ashes of their pride, that Odysseus spoke of a new kind of weapon, not of steel or fire, but of imagination. The others laughed, then listened, then began to understand. The Greeks would not take Troy by force. They would take it by faith. Far across the plain, within the city, the people of Troy looked down from their towers. The sea was quiet. The Greek fires burned low. No one knew that history was about to turn, not through battle, but through a single, perfect lie. The years blurred together. The war no longer felt like a story of heroes or destiny. It had become a habit, a slow, endless rhythm of hunger, fear, and hope. The beaches of Troy were no longer white. They were dark with ash and the remains of ships long abandoned. The sea, once filled with sails, now reflected only smoke. The songs that had once praised the courage of kings had turned into whispers about how many would live to see home again. Inside the Greek camp, time moved in circles. Men woke, fought, ate, buried their dead, and began again. The air stank of salt, sweat, and rot. The war had taken its toll not only on bodies, but on faith. The gods seemed far away. Prayers went unanswered. The offerings on the altars burned to cold ash. Agamemnon still commanded, but his authority was hollow. He had lost the respect of his men when he quarreled with Achilles, and now the camp was divided. Some wanted to go home. Others were too ashamed to return without victory. Only Odysseus watched and waited, his mind quietly turning over the same question: what would it take to break a city that refused to die? In Troy, the people endured their own kind of siege. The walls kept them safe, but they also kept them trapped. Food was rationed, wells were guarded, and the air inside the city grew heavy with tension. Priam ruled with dignity, but even he could see the weariness in his people's eyes. Mothers told their children stories of peace as the sound of Greek horns drifted over the walls. Hector's death had broken something in them. He had been their hope, their symbol of endurance. Without him, the soldiers fought because they had no choice. Paris tried to take his place, but he was not the man his brother had been. Helen, the woman for whom the war had begun, lived like a shadow in the palace, a ghost among the living. Some hated her, some pitied her, most avoided her altogether. At night, when the city slept, she would climb the walls and look down at the fires in the distance. 10 years of war, and still the same lights burned. She had long stopped believing that anyone would win. For the Greeks, each day was a test of patience. They raided nearby lands for food. They built and rebuilt their defenses. They repaired their ships but never sailed. Some nights, storms rose from the sea and tore through the camp, drowning men in their sleep. Other nights, they heard the distant sounds of music from Troy, faint songs carried by the wind, reminders that the enemy still lived, still laughed, still loved. It was the cruelty of time that hurt most. Achilles' armor passed to his son, Neoptolemus, who came to the war too late to find glory in it. The poets would later call him fierce, but in truth, he fought like a man trying to prove that his father's death still meant something. And yet, even he could see that victory was slipping away. The gods, once loud and meddling, had grown silent. Zeus had turned his gaze elsewhere. Athena's favor was uncertain. Apollo's wrath lingered. The mortals began to realize what the gods had always known, that the war no longer belonged to the divine. It belonged to the will of men, to their exhaustion, to their stubbornness, and so the war dragged on. 10 years became a lifetime. Boys who had once sailed from Greece as warriors now grew old under the same sun. Their armor dulled, their swords rusted, their memories faded. They no longer fought for Helen or for honor. They fought because they did not know how to stop. It was in this emptiness that Odysseus saw his opportunity. Where others saw defeat, he saw space for imagination. He began to speak quietly to the men around him, to the craftsmen, to the commanders. He studied the Trojans, their pride, their rituals, their faith. He understood what every story had in common. People believed what they wanted to believe. He visited the seers, those who still claimed to read the will of the gods. He asked them about signs, about prophecies, about what Troy feared most. They told him of Athena, the city's protector, and of a rumor whispered among the priests that if the Greeks ever offered her a sacred gift, the goddess might change her allegiance. That was the seed of an idea, a deception so beautiful it could only work because it felt divine. Odysseus returned to his tent and watched the flames of a dying fire. The sound of the sea outside was steady, like the beating of a drum. In that rhythm, he saw the shape of the plan that would end the war. But before the lie could live, the truth had to die. He convinced Agamemnon to prepare a retreat, to make the Greeks appear broken, desperate, ready to flee. Ships were loaded, tents dismantled, fires put out. Only one thing would remain on the shore, a gift for the gods. The war had lasted so long that both sides had forgotten what peace looked like. And so, when the Greeks vanished from the horizon and left behind the strange figure of a great wooden horse, the Trojans did not see danger. They saw an ending. They saw hope. They found it at dawn. The air was still, the sky pale with the first light of morning. Where the Greek camp had stood for years, there was only silence. The beaches were empty, the ships gone. The wind moved through the burnt sand, and there, in the center of the plain, stood the horse. It was enormous. Its head rose higher than the walls. Its body was made of dark, weathered timber, the seams sealed with pitch, the surface carved with symbols of Athena. It looked less like a gift and more like a warning. Yet it radiated something powerful, something sacred. The Greeks had left it behind, and the Trojans could not look away. They gathered around it, soldiers, priests, and children staring up in awe. Some whispered that it was an offering to the gods, a gesture of surrender and respect to Athena, who had long protected the city. Others felt unease. Laocoon, the high priest, spoke the words that would echo through time. Beware of Greeks, even when they bring gifts. He urged the people to burn it, to destroy the strange thing before it could curse them. He threw his spear into its side, and the hollow sound that came back was like thunder rolling inside a cave. For a moment, the crowd hesitated. Then came Sinon. They found him hiding near the shore, bound and bruised, claiming he had been left behind by his own people. He spoke with trembling conviction, weaving a story that sounded both tragic and divine. He said that the Greeks had angered Athena, and the horse was built as an offering to calm her wrath. It was large, he said, because they feared the Trojans might refuse the gift. And he warned them that if the horse ever entered the walls, it would bring the goddess's protection to Troy itself. The crowd listened. His lies were soft, believable, full of sorrow. He spoke of Agamemnon's cruelty, of the despair of men who longed for home, of the exhaustion of 10 endless years. By the time he finished, the people were no longer suspicious. They pitied him, they believed him, and they believed the horse was a blessing. But Laocoon did not. He moved to strike again, to burn the thing and end the argument. Before he could, a murmur spread through the crowd. From the sea, a storm was rising. The sky darkened, and 2 great serpents emerged from the water, their scales glistening, their eyes bright with divine fire. They struck without hesitation, coiling around Laocoon and his sons, crushing the life from them as the city watched in horror. The people screamed. Some fled, others fell to their knees. The priests declared it a sign the punishment of Athena for the priest's blasphemy. No one spoke against the horse again. As the storm passed, calm returned. The air smelled of rain and sea salt. The Trojans, shaken and grateful to be alive, took it as an omen of favor. They opened the gates that had been shut for a decade and brought the horse inside. It took hundreds of men to move it. They placed logs beneath its feet and rolled it through the gates, the wheels grinding over stone. The sound echoed through the streets like the heartbeat of something alive. Children ran beside it, laughing. Women threw flowers in its path. The priests chanted hymns to Athena. By the time it reached the central square, the sun had set, and torches flickered against the dark wood. That night, the city celebrated. After 10 years of fear, they felt peace. The soldiers drank, the musicians played. Even Helen, pale and silent, was seen among them, her face unreadable as she watched the firelight dance on the horse's surface. The people spoke of rebuilding, of new beginnings, of how the gods had finally forgiven them. Above them, the horse loomed, still and quiet. The streets emptied one by one. The wine ran dry. The laughter faded. The fires burned lower. In the deepest part of the night, when only the wind moved through the city, a panel in the horse's side began to shift. A hand reached out, then another. Odysseus was the first to climb down. Behind him came men chosen not for strength, but for silence. They spread across the city like shadows. They slit the throats of guards, opened the gates, and lit the beacons that signaled the waiting fleet. Out at sea, where the Greeks had hidden behind the nearest island, the ships began to move once more. Their oars bit into the black water. The wind filled their sails. By the time the Trojans awoke, it was too late. The gates were open. The army poured in. The city that had defied a decade of siege fell in a single night. Flames devoured the temples, the markets, the palaces. The cries of the dying drowned the sound of the sea. Priam was killed in his own hall. Cassandra was dragged away, her prophecies unheeded even in the end. Paris fell beneath an arrow, and Helen, the cause of it all, was led back to her husband, her beauty untouched, her soul hollow. By dawn, Troy was ash. The horse that had promised salvation stood amid ruin, blackened by smoke, its hollow belly empty. What had begun as a tale of gods and heroes ended as a story of deception, grief, and the quiet genius of one man who understood that faith is the most fragile weapon of all. The war was over, but its echo would never die. The city burned before the sun rose. The flames spread from roof to roof, crawling over the walls like living creatures. Smoke rolled into the sky and turned the stars to ash. The sound was not of war, but of something greater, the end of a world. Troy had stood for centuries. Its towers had watched generations live and die. Its gates had held against 1,000 assaults, yet in a single night all that strength was gone. The Greeks moved through the streets like ghosts, killing without thought, driven by the rage of 10 lost years. The people fled through alleys that led nowhere. Mothers hid their children in temples. Old men prayed to gods who no longer listened. King Priam sat in the courtyard of his palace, waiting for death. The war had taken his sons, his city, his name. When the soldiers found him, he spoke no words. They struck him down before the altar of Zeus. The marble floor ran red. In another part of the city, Aeneas, one of Troy's few surviving princes, carried his father on his shoulders and led a small band of refugees through the smoke. They fled toward the hills, guided by the faint glow of dawn. Behind them, the city crumbled, the heat of the fire chasing them like a second sun. Some said Aeneas would one day found another city, far to the west, a city that would rise from Troy's ashes. Helen stood at the gates of the palace, watching the flames consume everything she had ever known. Menelaus found her there, sword in hand, his face lit by fire. For a moment, they stared at each other, husband and wife, stranger and enemy. She said nothing. The stories tell different endings. Some say he raised his sword, and the gods turned it aside. Others say he dropped it and took her hand. In the end, she lived. That much is certain. She returned to Sparta, but peace never followed her. In the temples, the statues of gods cracked and fell. The great bronze doors of Athena's shrine buckled under the heat. The horse that had been brought in with songs of joy now stood blackened and silent, its hollow body split open, its secret revealed. The people who had worshipped it as a gift understood too late what it had been, not an offering, but a warning. By morning, the sea was filled with ships again. The Greeks loaded their spoils, their captives, and their guilt. Some prayed, others stayed silent. Odysseus watched from the shore, his eyes fixed on the ruins. He had won, but the victory felt hollow. He had ended the war, but at the cost of everything sacred. Around him, the men cheered, but their voices were thin, fragile, already fading into the wind. When the last flames died, nothing was left but the bones of a city. The walls that had once touched the sky were piles of broken stone. The fields where armies had clashed were littered with the remains of the fallen. The gods were gone, their temples silent. The wind moved through the ruins, carrying the smell of smoke and salt. The Greeks believed they had erased Troy from the earth, but they were wrong. A city can burn, its people can die. Yet, a story cannot be destroyed. It travels with the survivors, changes with the tellers, and grows stronger with time. Troy was gone, but its memory had only just begun. The victors sailed home, one by one, each ship carrying its own curse. Storms rose, ships sank. Agamemnon returned to Mycenae only to be murdered by his wife. Odysseus wandered for 10 more years. Lost in the sea, he thought he had conquered. The gods had not forgotten. No one who had touched Troy would ever find peace again. The sea slowly covered the traces of the war. Sand buried the ruins. Grass grew over the bones. The wind erased the footprints. And for 1,000 years, the story of the Trojan Horse lived only in the mouths of poets, a tale of pride, of cleverness, of divine will. But somewhere beneath the legend, beneath the songs and the names, a truth still waited, because what happened that night was more than myth. It was a lesson, a warning. Troy did not fall to strength, it fell to trust. The Greeks did not win with swords or ships. They won with belief, the same belief that builds cities, writes stories, and blinds us to the danger hidden behind what we most desire. The night of fire ended an age, and in its light, humanity saw itself clearly, for the first time clever enough to deceive, foolish enough to believe. The city was gone, but its lesson remained, carved into the heart of every story told since. Centuries passed. The story of Troy lived on, carried in songs and memory, whispered around fires, painted on pottery, carved into stone. The city itself was gone, its ruins lost beneath earth and silence. But the tale refused to die. It traveled across generations, across empires, and somewhere along the way, the wooden horse became more than a story. It became a question. What was it? For thousands of years, poets told us what they believed. Homer sang of gods and heroes, of fate and vengeance. Later, the Romans took the story as their own. They said that from Troy's ashes came Aeneas, and from Aeneas, Rome itself. The fall of one city became the birth of another. In time, the horse became a symbol of destiny, of how even destruction can give birth to greatness. But not everyone believed. For centuries, scholars doubted there had ever been a Troy. They said it was only myth, a moral tale about pride and punishment. Then, in the 19th century, a man named Heinrich Schliemann decided to prove them wrong. He was not a historian, but a dreamer, a merchant obsessed with Homer's words. With little more than faith and instinct, he traveled to a hill in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik. The locals said the mound was cursed, haunted by spirits of the dead. Schliemann believed it was Troy. He began to dig. What he found astonished the world. Layer by layer, the hill revealed buried cities, 9 of them, one on top of another. Walls, towers, pottery, weapons, jewelry. Evidence of a place that had risen and fallen again and again across centuries. One of those layers, marked by fire and destruction, dated roughly to the time when Homer's war might have taken place. Schliemann declared he had found Troy. Others doubted his methods, but his discovery changed history. The legend had roots in the real earth. Later archaeologists returned with better tools and steadier hands. They found new details, traces of battle, arrowheads, burnt stones, human remains. They discovered that the city had been rebuilt many times, its people stubborn and proud, just as the stories said. Some walls were 12 feet thick, made to withstand any assault. It was a city meant to endure, and yet it had burned more than once. But no sign of the horse, no fragments of wood, no carvings, nothing. The story of the horse existed only in words, and so began another kind of search, not for the object, but for its meaning. Some historians believe the horse was never real at all. They say it was a symbol, a poetic way of describing a weapon or event. One theory claims it was a siege machine, a great wooden tower used to breach the walls, later remembered as a gift. Another suggests it was a ship, the kind the Greeks called hippos, or horse. Perhaps the Trojans mistook the word, and over time, the ship became a statue. There are those who think the horse was a hidden tunnel, a secret passage beneath the walls through which the Greeks entered the city. Each theory offers a fragment of truth. None can explain the whole. The story remains larger than the evidence. It survives not because it can be proven, but because it speaks to something deeper than proof. The Trojan horse may have been a lie, but it was a perfect lie, a lie that reveals more about us than about them. It shows how belief can become a weapon, how trust can open gates that no army could ever break. Even today, the image endures. In politics, in technology, in every quiet deception that hides inside a gift. The phrase Trojan horse has outlived the city that gave it meaning. It is a reminder that every civilization, no matter how strong, carries within it the possibility of its own undoing. Somewhere beneath the fields of Hisarlik, the stones of Troy still rest in the soil. Archaeologists continue to dig, to brush away the dust, to search for what might be left. But perhaps the truth cannot be unearthed, because it was never buried in the ground. It was buried in us, in our memory, our imagination, our need to believe that every ruin has a story, and every story hides a truth. The horse was never just a wooden statue. It was the embodiment of every choice made in pride, every victory born from deceit. every moment when trust became a weapon. The Greeks built it to win a war. We have carried it ever since as a mirror. And when we look into that mirror, we still see Troy burning. The story of the Trojan horse is older than any nation, older than any written history. It has outlived the men who fought, the poets who sang, and the cities that rose after Troy fell. Yet it endures not because of what happened, but because of what it means. We tell it again and again, as if by repeating it we might understand something about ourselves. But perhaps it is not a story about heroes or gods. Perhaps it is a story about us, about the human heart and the fragile line between faith and reason. In every age, we build walls. We call them cities, empires, systems, beliefs. We build them to feel safe. And in every age, someone finds a way inside, not through force, but through trust. The Greeks at the gates of Troy knew what we all eventually learned, that what we fear most is not the enemy outside our walls, but the one we invite in. The Trojan horse was not just a trick. It was a reflection of the oldest truth in history, that deception is strongest when it wears the face of a gift, that ruin often comes wrapped in beauty. For the Trojans, it was faith in their gods. For the Greeks, it was pride in their cunning. Both believed they were chosen. Both were wrong. Across time, the story became a mirror. Rome saw itself in the ashes of Troy and built an empire from its memory. Centuries later, kings, generals, and poets retold the tale to remind themselves that power is fragile, that victory and destruction often share the same face. Even now, in our world of machines and wires, the phrase remains a digital ghost of an ancient deceit, a reminder that not all dangers break down the door. Some wait for us to open it. The story of the Trojan horse survives because it is not about war. It is about human nature, about how easily we believe what we want to be true, how deeply we long for peace after fear, and how quickly that longing can blind us. It reminds us that the fall of Troy was not the work of gods, but of men clever, desperate, and tragically certain of their own wisdom. In the end, the lesson is simple, but it is one we never seem to learn. Strength can protect walls. Only wisdom can protect the heart. And so the horse stands forever, not in wood or stone, but in memory tall and silent, its belly filled with everything we choose not to see. The sea still moves along the coast where Troy once stood. The wind still whispers through the hills of Hisarlik. If you listen closely, you might still hear the echo of that night, the creak of wood, the opening of gates, the breath before fire. And in that sound, across 3,000 years, the story still speaks. It tells us that no civilization, no empire, no person is immune to its own illusion, that the walls we trust most may already carry the seeds of their undoing. The story of the Trojan horse is not just about how Troy fell. It is about how belief can blind, how pride can destroy, and how even the cleverest of victories can leave nothing but ashes behind. Because in the end, Troy was not conquered by strength, it was conquered by faith. And faith, once deceived, can burn a city to the ground.